5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of the BackMarkers F1 Show podcast. This is episode 29. Chris Cato alongside you to bring you the recap of the latest race of the season, the Japanese Grand Prix, as we're winding toward the end of the season, guys. We only have, I believe, 3 races after this, or 4. So we have the United States Grand Prix coming up next, then we go to Mexico, Brazil, and finishing off in Abu Dhabi. So not much left to go in the season, and not much left to go in the championship either. So I'll be touching on that later on in the show. Flying solo today, if we have any Canadian fans out there watching, it is Thanksgiving, so a holiday here in Canada. So happy Thanksgiving to any of our Canadian viewers. So first things first, we'll backtrack a little bit to earlier on in the weekend for qualifying. Probably in a very interesting qualifying session, actually, because of the interchangeable conditions in the wet and also in the dry. I thought it was going to be more of a monsoon-type qualifying like we had last year in Japan, but it actually stayed relatively dry. I mean, the rain did come, but then the sun came out afterwards, so it was kind of a mix here and there, and it was really all about who was on the right tire and eventually, who could get out at the right time and capitalize from a good strategy for qualifying. So I got to talk about the Ferrari incident that happened. So if you guys missed qualifying, Ferrari started Q3 on the intermediate tires. They went out for basically one run around the track, and they saw that it was just way too dry. There was no way that they could run the wet tires, so they had to go back to the slicks. So, people were saying, and obviously criticizing Ferrari because why did they go out? They lost time. Mercedes were able to go out and put a lap in right away, whereas Ferrari had to come in, do another pit stop, and then go out again. But, honestly, I think it definitely was a mistake from Ferrari. I don't know where or who they're getting their information from, but if all the other teams went out on the soft tires or the super soft, it was the super soft when they were qualifying on, they must have had good information in terms of what the weather conditions were like and the track conditions. So I'm not sure why Ferrari got that so wrong. That kind of surprised me a little bit because no other team did that. So, and even if the track was wet, I mean, it probably wouldn't have paid off for them that much. But anyways, so that wasn't necessarily the problem because they had time. They still had plenty of time to come in, fit the super soft tires because they just did, a pit stop like they would in a race. So technically, they didn't really lose that much time. The issue was, once again, Sebastian Vettel. Vettel made the mistake going into Spoon Corner on that first run after he came out on the super soft tires. And, one of the things that kind of confused me was he clearly made a mistake. I mean, he ran wide off the track, and he knew, I think the team probably knew as well that, okay, this was not going to be a good lap. But what kind of confused me was he completed the lap and then went around for a cool-down lap and then boxed again to fit on a new set of super soft tires. So for me at that point, because they made that mistake with putting on the intermediate tires and left, a little time on the table, they should have just pitted right away, aborted that lap, fitted on the super soft tires again, a new set, and gone out. They would have saved probably 90 seconds because Vettel crossed the line and then did a cool-down lap, which is obviously a lot slower than you would go normally for a qualifying pace. So he lost around 90 seconds just having to go around the circuit again, box again, and then have to go out on a new set. So that part confused me of why he didn't pit right away, just abort the lap. And I know maybe the thinking was that we wanted to put a time up on the board, but you eventually finish P9, with that lap anyway. So to me, he wouldn't have lost had he just pitted anyway right after that mistake. So that kind of confused me. And yeah, it was just after that, it was just a complete disaster because when they pitted, I believe, for the second time and then gone out, by that time, the rain had started to come, and it was just way too slick on the track. You saw, I think it was Kevin Magnussen who went out first, and right away you could tell that there was just no way that they were going to be able to put in a competitive lap time to challenge the Mercedes of Hamilton and Bottas, who, got it right. Mercedes, once again, with the strategy, putting them out at the right time, they got in a good lap, and were able to get pole for Hamilton and Bottas on the front row of the grid as well. But Raikkonen got in a time and was for P4, I believe. So once again, it was more of a mistake from Sebastian Vettel, because Paul di Resta kind of summed it up really well on the Sky Sports 1 broadcast when he said that technically Ferrari had the best conditions, on the track when they went out at that time, because a couple of the cars and the front runners had already gone out and done a lap or so. So it created a dry racing line. There was a bit more grip, bit more temperature in the track as well. So technically, when Ferrari went out, that was probably the best time to go out and put on a good lap, because that had the highest grip on the track at the moment. And Vettel just blew it once again. So it kind of all started from there for Ferrari and for the whole weekend as well. In terms of the pace, they looked like they were a bit closer. It was only a tenth in free practice 3, although that was, again, interchangeable conditions. But, all in all, it looked like they were a bit closer to Mercedes in terms of car performance than they were in Russia and they were in Singapore, although the Ferrari, you heard maybe Vettel on the radio as well, was complaining about the rear instability and the balance just wasn't that great. And you could tell, on the onboards and when they kind of broke down the laps of Lewis Hamilton versus Vettel. So they weren't exactly happy with the car, but I think it was overall a bit better than what it was in the previous weekends. So and then just quickly on qualifying as well, Toro Rosso put on, just a tremendous qualifying session. Both cars into Q3, and their home Grand Prix, of course, you guys probably saw the support that they had. A lot of support actually for Red Bull as well, because they're excited for that partnership coming in next year. So I said this on the Friday practice, I think Honda's just slowly starting to turn the corner in Formula One. A couple of the results this year have been really, really good, P4 and Bahrain, for example, but they've gotten into Q3 at the power-heavy circuits. They've held their own. They've been pretty good in the top 10 in the speed traps as well. So, they look as good as they have since they came back into the sport in 2015. So I think that they could be looking at a real turning point here going into next year with a championship team like Red Bull, who has, a lot of experience, more resources. So maybe that they can work something out here and eventually have a competitive engine on the track. And they're only supplying two teams, and both teams are essentially, the same, right? That Toro Rosso is Red Bull's junior team. So, and Gasly, who has experience with the Honda engine this year, going into Red Bull for next year, will have an advantage there as well, being able to help out with development with the Red Bull guys as well. So I think it's honestly going to be a good partnership. I think that we'll look back maybe in a couple seasons and think that switch from Renault to Honda was a good thing. Or I could be completely wrong, and it could just end up being the same way it was, the previous 4 years. But I think it was really funny because last year McLaren qualified P10, P11 here in Japan with the Honda engine, and this year they only finished ahead of a guy who crashed out in Marcus Ericsson. So, McLaren, it just an even worse year, to be quite honest with you guys. They've even had a worse year with the Renault engine than they did with the Honda. So I think a lot of issues with that team. But it's kind of embarrassing just to see a team like McLaren because, again, everybody knows their storied history, but all the stuff that they were saying about Honda, it turns out maybe it wasn't so much Honda as it was also issues with the team as well. So, they got a lot of work to do from now until 2019 in March. And also Lance Stroll. I was really impressed with Lance Stroll. We don't mention the Canadian that much, of course, with that Williams, but I thought his Q1 lap was really phenomenal, actually, to get himself into Q2. He drove really well. He qualified well here last year. So he started to show a little bit, why, and if he put him in a better car, I think that he could start to show us some really, really solid results. So if he does go to Force India, which is looking very likely for 2019, I'm really interested to see what he can do with a better car in his hands. And I think he'll show a lot of the quality that he has shown in 2017 and also at certain times this year. Of course, it's been really difficult, but not much that you can do when you've got a team like Williams who's struggling so much. So that was it from qualifying. So heading into the race, it looked like it was going to be another Hamilton win, which obviously it ended up being. But the race itself wasn't bad, actually. There was a lot of overtaking, which they said Suzuka was a very tough track to overtake. And just by the way, they need to do whatever they can to keep this track on the calendar. This is probably one of my favorite tracks on the calendar because it's an old school track, a lot of gravel traps, not a whole lot of runoff areas. And you saw it in qualifying, you saw it in practice. When you make a mistake, you pay for it. And that's what the old school tracks are like. There's not these long, paved escape roads like some other tracks, in the calendar. So having a track like this where it's all about driver skill, and when they push the limits, they pay for it sometimes if they go wide. So I love seeing that. And again, just seeing the cars go through the S's was fantastic. And even the slower cars, it was still impressive to see, the G-forces and the downforce the downforce that the cars can generate. So that was a lot of fun to see. And yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem with this race was that it coincided with, UFC 229 that was on Saturday. So if you were in the East Coast like myself, the main event was roughly starting around the same time as the race. So a lot of people in the UK were also watching the UFC 229 main event to support Conor McGregor. So the race in Japan had a little bit of a dip in viewership numbers because of that. And I mean, it's hard to argue because it ended up being, probably one of the best sporting events of the year. Even if you're not a fan, I recommend that you watch the fight itself, and of course all the crazy post-fight antics. It was amazing. It was amazing to watch. Congratulations to Khabib on the win. So yeah, that was a little bit of a problem for the Japanese Grand Prix just because there was a lot of excitement for that main event. So I actually watched the race the next day just because there was so much going on from that it was hard to focus on the race. But I think the race eventually delivered some good on-track battles. Not so much drama at the front in terms of the leaders, but for the championship, of course, there was a lot that happened. Vettel got a really good start, starting in P9. He made up a couple positions, heading into turn 1. And I think Ferrari, this has been one thing that they've stayed consistent on all year is their starts. I don't know if that extra paddle, if you guys remember at the beginning of the season, they had an extra paddle on the steering wheel. I don't know if that's helping them on their launches, but yeah, I mean, they just have so much more grip and not that much wheel spin on the rear, too, when they get going off of the grid. So, yeah, he made positions up really quickly. I mean, I think he was up to about P4 by lap 3, so he got past, the Toro Rossos pretty quickly. A great move on, I think it was Grosjean as well. Grosjean probably wasn't even expecting that for Vettel to come alongside him. So that was good. I mean, it was looking good up until that point, and then you had the incident with Max Verstappen and Kimi Räikkönen where Verstappen locked up going into, the final turn, and then, he tried to come back onto the track sort of so that he doesn't cut the corner because obviously he's had issues in the past cutting the corner, gaining the advantage. So for him, his thinking was, I think, that I'm going to come back into the track so I don't get a penalty for, cutting the corner, cutting the chicane. But that eventually is what cost him the 5-second penalty because he came back onto the track unsafely, bumped into Kimi Räikkönen, pushed him wide, and then gained an advantage that way. So I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about the incident. So comment below what you think of the Verstappen-Räikkönen incident, and was the 5 seconds fair? Listening to the explanation from Charlie Whiting, I think if you go by the rules that it was a fair penalty because it wasn't so much the contact with Räikkönen and pushing him off the track. It was the fact that he came back onto the track unsafely, right? So it was almost, I think, a better situation for Max if he would have just gone straight off, use the little runoff area that's there, and then just come back into the track. And then maybe, I don't know if they would have made him, bring the position back to Räikkönen or whatever. I don't know, but I think that was the issue. So if you go by the rules, I mean, technically, yes. But at the same time, I could also see how people thought it was a racing incident. I think the penalty was fair if you're going by the book, but I mean, there's so much inconsistency with the FIA in terms of the way they hand out penalties. We saw Magnussen didn't get a penalty for sort of cutting off Charles Leclerc, which, again, the reasoning that they gave for it was when they broke it down on video, Charles Leclerc moved at the same time that Kevin Magnussen did. So it wasn't like it was as late as maybe, we saw it in real time. So they said that when they broke it down, Magnussen moved a frame later than Charles Leclerc, which is, not even a half a second, right? So, I mean, when you look at it from that point of view, I mean, but it was dangerous, right? Because especially a corner like that, that's such high speed. You don't want to move under braking, but that's sort of what Vettel did last week in Russia as well, and he didn't get a penalty for it. So, yeah, I mean, this is the big problem, right? Is for fans, it's hard to tell what's a penalty and what's not a penalty because we've seen in different situations, different drivers in different teams get different penalties, right? So there's not really sort of a consistency with the FIA in terms of the way they hand out these penalties, but I think that we want to see more more on-track racing, more wheel-to-wheel action. So if you let the drivers race, I think that's a positive. And, if you keep handing out penalties all the time, that's not going to make it very exciting for the fans. So, but yeah, I'm interested to see what you guys have to think, because I was sort of a bit indifferent on it, to be honest with you, because, yeah, I thought in terms of the Max Verstappen thing, probably would have been okay if you just wouldn't have given a penalty. But yeah, that's just the way it is. So that made things interesting for Sebastian Vettel, because a lap or two later, he came in on Verstappen, very optimistically tried to overtake him going into Spoon, which is probably not the best place for overtaking, quite honestly. And Max left him room a little bit. He did close off, but that's because he was trying to make the turn. So on that incident itself, it's my opinion that he completely made a mistake, did Sebastian Vettel. I don't think that was really necessary, because if you look at it in terms of where they were at the race, Vettel was in P4. He should have known, and he said that he did know that Max Verstappen had the penalty, but that he doesn't regret making the move. I think that it was just too early. I mean, he made that move as if it was the second last lap or the last lap of the race, and like he needed to get past him. But I mean, after Spoon, you go into that little short straight before 130R, which is pretty much completely flat up until you get to the final chicane. So with that Ferrari engine versus the Renault engine, and Max again complaining about engine issues all weekend long and the lack of power, I don't understand why Vettel thought that he really needed to get past him in that specific corner. Again, a very difficult place for overtaking, and he paid for it. He paid for it. He spun out. He got side pod damage, and that ruined the race at that point, because I get the argument. People were saying he needed to get by him as quick as possible and not in the pit stops because the Mercedes were pulling away. Fair enough, but he could have waited another 2 to 3 corners and he would have gotten by him. I mean, I think in terms of the power advantage, Ferrari is far superior than that Renault engine. So even if he doesn't get by him in 130R or the chicane, he's going to get him in the main straight, because he's going to have DRS as well. He'll have probably a good enough advantage in the ERS deployment as well if the battery was charged up. So I don't understand why he thought that he needed to make that overtake right then and there. I mean, it wasn't the last lap of the race. It was in the very early stages of the race. And he had made up so much ground up until that point that it seemed like, okay, he probably wouldn't win the race anyway, but at least he could maybe get himself on the podium, or maybe even challenge Valtteri Bottas at the end of the race. But, once again, when push comes to shove, Vettel he's cracking under pressure, and it almost seemed like he just threw in the towel at this race and said, you know what, it's over. It looked like it was over heading into this race, but now 67-point lead, guys. I mean, it definitely is over. Lewis Hamilton can clinch at the next race in Austin, Texas. So, I mean, it's just frustrating. And again, I'm a fan of Vettel and obviously a fan of Ferrari, but I'm more of a fan of close racing and also a very tight championship battle. And we didn't get it this year. I mean, we got it up until probably Belgium, and then after that, it just kind of fell apart for Ferrari. So, yeah, the commentators were talking about it. All the experts were talking about it, how when Lewis Hamilton goes for those overtakes, you just don't see these mistakes being made. He's very calculated. He knows when he needs to take those risks. He knows when he needs to push. But it seems like Vettel just, I don't know, maybe it was just desperation and he had to go for it. He was very upset with Max Verstappen, but I don't really think that was Max Verstappen's fault in there, you know what I mean? He probably didn't even expect Vettel to make that move. It was very, very optimistic. I don't think that he probably would have pulled it off anyway. And that Red Bull is pretty good in those types of corners as well. So I just don't see why you don't wait another corner or two to get a better chance at him. You wait till the straights when you have a significant power advantage, and you try and overtake him there. I understand the argument, again, of not having to wait for the pit stops because Max would have served that 5 seconds. I understand that argument, but still, another corner or two, I guarantee you that he would have had him. So, yeah, I don't know what Vettel's thinking was at that moment, but I just think there's so much pressure, and he realized that the championship was slipping through his fingers, that he needed to do something drastic, and unfortunately, like the last couple of weeks and races, it's backfired on him. So, another really, really rough day for Ferrari. Going down the order for the rest of the race, a really good midfield battle again. I mean, the midfield is starting to become really, really interesting, and I'm just gonna go to the driver standings here. So, of course, when we look past the top six of the Ferraris, the Red Bulls, and the Mercedes, you got a really interesting battle here. From basically 7 to 10, you have Sergio Perez in the Force India in P7 in the championship right now at 53 points, and he's tied actually with Kevin Magnussen in 8th for 53 points. And actually, sorry, excuse me, it's a three-way tie between Perez, Magnussen, and Hulkenberg for P7. All have 53 points, and then close behind in P10, you got Fernando Alonso, who has 50 points, 49 points for Ocon in P11, and a little bit farther behind, Carlos Sainz in P12 and 39 points. But, I mean, he's still within touching distance, so a really interesting midfield battle for that best of the rest spot, and of course, a lot of on the line as well for constructors and the prize money, so that's been the most interesting storyline as the championship lead has sort of fallen apart for Vettel and Ferrari. The battle in the midfield has honestly been very exciting, and that's going to come down to the wire, I think, in the last race of who can get that best of the rest spot in 7th place. Of course, Ricciardo's way ahead in 6th with 146 points, so I mean that's not really going to be any challenge, but a lot of good on-track battles you had when they were coming out of the pits. I think that was I want to say it was maybe Magnussen or whatever, but even Vettel got in with the Force India in that sequence, so that was really exciting to see, and we've seen a lot of these battles in Singapore as well through the midfield, so it's unfortunate because I want to see that battle going on at the front with the Ferrari and the Mercedes and even throwing in the Red Bull. So we'll just have to settle for the on-track battle between the midfield, which I think will become really, really exciting in the latter stages of the season. So we'll see how that all plays out with the last 4 races of the year. And that was pretty much it from the Japanese Grand Prix. Like I said, a pretty solid race. We've seen more overtaking in the last couple of races. They said Russia was difficult to overtake, Japan was difficult to overtake, but guys like Vettel, Daniel Ricciardo showed that it definitely is possible, and we did get good battles in the midfield. So that's a positive change, I think, if we're starting to see a lot more overtakes than we did in the last year or so. And that's at least keeping the races somewhat interesting because, I mean, let's be real. At the front, it was pretty much a snooze fest. We knew that Hamilton and Mercedes were going to pull away. So, yeah, that's just the way it is. I think I'm just really disappointed that it hasn't come down to the wire in terms of the battle between Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. That's just really disappointing. I mean, I do like Sebastian Vettel. I'm a fan of his, obviously a fan of Ferrari. But at the end of the day, I'm a fan of the sport even more. So you want a really close championship battle. You want something like 2016 Rosberg and Hamilton. You want something like the 2010 championship where you had 3 or 4 drivers who possibly could have won the title at the last race of the season. So the last 2 years, it's kind of been a foregone conclusion, and the championship's been wrapped up a couple races ahead of the last one. So it's not necessarily the best for the sport in terms of entertainment. So going into the United States Grand Prix, which is about 2 weeks from now in Austin, Texas, one of Lewis Hamilton's best tracks of this decade, and is a very successful one for him and Mercedes. He won last year. Excuse me. And, of course, in 2015, he actually wrapped up the championship there as well, the Drivers' Championship. So, basically, there's a lot of different scenarios in terms of the way the title can be confirmed in Austin, Texas, in the United States. But the simplest way to put it is if he outscores Sebastian Vettel by 8 points, he will be the 2018 Formula One World Champion. So, a lot of different scenarios in which that can play out. But if he outscores him by more than 8 points, then Lewis Hamilton will be the world champion. So I think he'll most likely get it done in the U.S. I mean, of course, we know a lot about the fact that he spends a lot of time in the United States. He's got a lot of business going on in there as well, so this is probably one of his most favorite races of the year. So, yeah, he'll be super excited, super motivated going into this race, a track that he loves, a track that flows really well for the Mercedes as well. So, yeah, I think he'll probably get it done. I think Vettel and Ferrari are just defeated at this point. As I said earlier, sort of just threw in the towel in the Japanese Grand Prix and sort of in the last few races as well. So you're probably looking at Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton popping some champagne when we get to Austin, Texas. So whether you love him or hate him, that's probably going to happen. So you want to tune in for that. But getting into before I wrap up this recap podcast, but I found some interesting sort of notes earlier in the week as to maybe why Ferrari have sort of had a loss of sudden power, because we talked about this in our Russian Grand Prix recap that, it was only 2 or 3 races ago in Italy where they locked out the front row, in Belgium in the beginning of September, or end of August, excuse me, where, Ferrari had a significant power advantage on Mercedes. And it looked like, all right, we're in store for a really good down to the wire championship battle. And after Italy, it's just been a significant drop. So I tweeted this earlier in the week that, excuse me, that could a FIA sensor that was added to the Ferrari be the reason for sudden loss in power. So this is coming from Germany's Auto Motor und Sport. I think it was a website that says a second FIA sensor was fitted recently to the Ferrari, and this apparently resulted in a sudden drop in performance per GPS data collected by rival teams. A quote from Renault boss Cyril Abiteboul that said, "We can see it clearly in our GPS measurements that they have had a significant drop in performance." And I believe that is all related to on the power unit side. And if you guys remember earlier in the year, the FIA was investigating a dual battery energy storage system that Mercedes and Renault complained about, but eventually didn't find anything illegal. So, not really sure what to make of it. I mean, it seemed like Arrivabene confirmed it because, he said that he didn't know where that information was leaked from and that he was worried about this, leaking future things as well. So it seemed like he really didn't know where this information came from because it wasn't something that was supposed to be released. It wasn't something that was supposed to be public. So, I mean, it could add up. If you look at the timeline, if that sensor was fitted in Singapore, that's sort of where we started to see this drop in performance. If it was even fitted in Russia, I mean, like I said, they were about 0.5 off Mercedes. So, I mean, it was a pretty significant drop. Now, it could also just be the fact that Mercedes have just done a better job in their upgrades, in their power unit. They've just tweaked some things. And maybe it's just research and development. They've just done a better job, and Ferrari have been lacking. They've fallen behind, even though they were ahead. Ferrari was most of the year in terms of car performance. So I think it's a little bit suspicious for me, in my opinion, because the whole year it just seemed like Ferrari had the power advantage. Even in races like Spain or France, where Mercedes seemed like they took that step ahead, Ferrari would come back and just one-up them. They won the race in Britain. After Spain, they won a race in Canada that normally are Mercedes tracks that turned into a Ferrari advantage. So I think something's fishy going on here in the background that we probably won't find out what happened exactly. We know that Ferrari, especially in the past, in the Schumacher days and these days as well, they always try and push the limit. They've probably done a lot of illegal stuff in the past, maybe this year as well, in terms of performance. I mean, all these teams, I think, really try and push the rules in terms of what they can get away with. So this could be the answer as to why they've had such a significant drop in the power advantage and why they've been struggling. And I found this other thing from James Alderson on Twitter that said, now that the championship is basically over, I'm going to share some juicy info. After Australia and Mercedes had to modify their power unit, they had a chamber of oil at the top of the pistons to burn designed to circumvent the FIA sensor. It lost them about 10 to 15 horsepower off the bat. The FIA and Mercedes forged an agreement to keep this quiet and that there would be no penalty for the sake of the battle between Mercedes and Ferrari. So as he understands it, they were putting the oil reverse in there when the power unit was built, as that area of the engine was restricted from being modified, so it would only have a very limited supply for use on desperate laps. So I don't know who his source is. He's not going to reveal the source, of course, because he said that it would get them in trouble. But an interesting piece of info that I just wanted to share with you guys that I found. You always kind of find these interesting things on Twitter. Now, whether it's real, whether it's true, I don't know. I can't personally confirm it. So, I don't want to put this out as to say that this is 100% confirmed, because it's not. But you can kind of come to your own conclusions from this as well. So, interesting times. And Ross Brawn actually, earlier in the week, made the comments on Ferrari that the passing of their Ferrari's CEO, I believe he was Sergio Marchionne, in July, is actually one of the reasons why they've had such a struggle since the summer break. Obviously he was a huge part of the team, and that was a sudden loss for them. I believe he was only 63 years of age, and it was some sort of surgery complication. So he was a big part of that team, of course, and that was maybe a shocking loss to the team, and that maybe they didn't have some sort of a sense of direction and leadership. But then again, that happened in July. They came out after the summer break looking good. In Belgium and Italy, they looked good. So I don't really think that was the main reason. I think that's a small part of it, but it's more so just the issues of the car hasn't performed as well as it did earlier in the season. Vettel's been making more mistakes. Ferrari, the team itself, haven't been so together. They've been making mistakes. So, I think that's an interesting little tidbit from Ross Brawn, but I don't think that's so much the issue. I think there's a lot more going on here than what the public knows. So I don't know if we'll have anything come out at the end of the year. Whether Ferrari will be making management changes, I don't know, but we'll see what happens. And before we go, another little piece of news is that Vietnam might be poised for a 2020 F1 calendar slot. That's right, Vietnam. I did not know that Vietnam was a hotbed for Formula One racing, but maybe it's a chance for the Liberty Media owners to make some money. But plans are put in place to put Vietnam on the Formula One calendar in 2020. They're set to be confirmed before the end of the current season, with sources indicating that a deal has now been reached. So this article coming from motorsport.com. The Southeast Asian country has long been rumored to be on the radar of F1's owners, Liberty Media, with a venue of 12 kilometers west of Hanoi having been singled out as a location for the track. The talks have advanced quickly behind the scenes, and sources at last weekend's Japanese Grand Prix insisted that an agreement was now in place for the event to go ahead in 2020. Just going down here a little bit later. So Charlie Whiting visited the location ahead of the Japanese Grand Prix and said that he has no doubts that the facility would be ready by 2020. There's actually no progress on building the track, but the site has been identified. So it's in the stages of design, as they go on to say. And it's mainly going to be a street circuit similar to the one in Singapore and I think in Russia. But the part of the track will be built there, which doesn't exist at the moment, but it will become a road after that. So very interesting. And they have attached a link to a video that Red Bull did a show run in Vietnam a couple years ago. And they do this a lot. They've done this in cities where we have Formula One races like Budapest or London, Berlin. They did that amazing video, if you guys saw in the summer, where Ricardo did his run through the United States, in San Francisco, New York, in the Desert Valley, like everywhere, right? So Red Bull is actually the main really team that does these show runs that kind of promotes Formula One in these locations where maybe they don't know a whole lot about it or they don't really watch it. So yeah, it almost seems like this is almost a done deal for 2020. Now we know that Miami has been rumored as well. It won't be on the grid in 2019, but 2020 was an aim that Miami would get the track. I think Miami has a lot more to sort out in terms of that track layout, as it was kind of a bit of a sketchy layout as it is. But that is another street circuit as well. So, you're starting to see Liberty Media kind of expand out more into the entire world. Like I said, I don't really know if Vietnam is a popular place for Formula One. Probably isn't, but if Liberty Media sees the chance to make money and to bring the sport to there, they're going to do it, right? But at the same time, I'd like to see more kind of tracks. Like I said, Germany has been, not on the F1 calendar in the past couple of years. I'd like to see a Dutch Grand Prix come back onto the calendar. For me, there's just a lot more tracks that are more historic to Formula One. In Estoril, for example, even a track in Argentina, I believe it was Buenos Aires, that had a track as well. So there's just a lot of, I think, better tracks out there. Even in the UK, a track like Brands Hatch that you could use for Formula One as well. So I'd honestly rather see those tracks come onto the calendar before than some of these, street circuits that might not even produce great racing. So we'll see what happens. Obviously, that's a couple years down the road, but an interesting development for Formula One. So that's about it for the Japanese Grand Prix. That's a lot to go through, guys, when you're just sitting here solo, but I hopefully provided you guys with all the info that you need to know post-Japanese Grand Prix. We got about a little less than 2 weeks before the U.S. Grand Prix. Really nice that those Grand Prix are going to be sort of friendly to the Eastern time zone here for us in Canada, so that will be about a 2 p.m. start for us. I know the Japanese Grand Prix was a tough one for everybody to get up for, no matter where you are in the world, but yeah, that's what F1 fans do. We're committed to watching all of our races, so yeah, that should be a good one as well. And Lewis Hamilton could be clinching the championship in Austin, Texas. And also quickly on F1 Fantasy, I'm just doing some checks of our league as we've had some complaints that we've had somebody join at the last minute who is at the top of our leaderboard. But I will have to double check also with Shaker and Tyler and check our sort of admin account to see exactly when did they join. Because we would just want to make sure that they are eligible and that the whole leaderboard and the whole prize system is fair for everybody. So we'll update you that probably this week or the next. And we do have our prizes, so they have arrived. So we will get that tweeted out and put on our Instagram within the next week before the U.S. Grand Prix. So we just want to make sure that everything is an even level playing field. So we'll update you guys on that soon. And that's about it for me for the Japanese Grand Prix Recap podcast. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, as always. We appreciate your listen. We appreciate your comments, too. We had a lot in the last previous episode, so continue to do that. You can comment on this video below. What did you think of some of the race incidents, Verstappen and Vettel, Verstappen and Raikkonen? What do you think of the whole championship picture now that it's pretty much done and dusted? Yeah, chime in on Twitter, on Instagram as well. Send us your questions, send us your comments. We want to include you in the show, so always try and interact with us. We try and get back to you as soon as possible. Subscribe to us on YouTube, and make sure you click that bell as well, as you can stay up to date and subscribe to us so you get a little email notification as well, a notification on your phone for any time we post a new video. So we're almost at 200 subscribers, so we want to kind of bump that up a little bit before the end of the season. So help us out a little bit in that regard. Share with your friends, share with your family. Let them know that we always provide you with a podcast after every race and throughout the weeks as well. So make sure you get on that as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for joining us. We'll be back in a couple weeks' time for the United States Grand Prix. Until then, it's bye for now.